She hid a broken collarbone beneath that apron for almost 2 years. Nobody asked. Nobody looked. Until the most dangerous man in the city tasted her cannoli and asked one question that shattered the silence she had built her entire life around. If this story already has you holding your breath, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The alarm went off at 3:47 in the morning, same as always, and Noelle Ashcroft was already awake. She lay flat on her back on the narrow mattress in her studio apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a hand reaching for something it would never touch. The radiator knocked against the wall in the corner. Outside, a truck rumbled past on wet asphalt. She listened to it fade, and then she reached over and silenced the alarm before the second buzz, because she was always awake before it, had been for nearly 2 years now. Ever since her body stopped trusting sleep the way most people stopped trusting strangers after they got robbed. She sat up slowly. Not because she was tired. She had gotten reasonably good at functioning on 4 hours and the bitter dregs of a pot she brewed the night before and reheated each morning without apology. She sat up slowly because the left side of her collarbone reminded her, every single time, that certain movements had consequences. A sharp inhale through the nose. 2 fingers pressed lightly against the ridge of bone just below her left shoulder. Hold, release, move on. That was the ritual. That was how every morning started. She was 28 years old and she moved like a woman 30 years older than that. And she had gotten so good at hiding it that some days she almost convinced herself there was nothing to hide. Almost. The bathroom mirror was unforgiving in the way of cheap fluorescent bulbs and inadequate sleep. She studied herself with the flat, clinical detachment of someone assessing damage on a car they no longer expected to run perfectly, just well enough to get from one place to the next. Dark circles. Hair that she pulled back without bothering to brush, because no one in a professional kitchen cared about your hair as long as it was contained. A face that had once been called pretty by people who meant it, and had been called worse things by someone who also meant it. She pulled on her clothes without drama. Black chef's pants, worn soft at the knees. A fitted thermal long sleeve that she would wear under everything else regardless of the season because it added one more layer between the world and the left side of her body. Then the apron. The apron was the thing. It was oversized by design. She had bought it 2 sizes too large. Thick natural leather, the kind that bartenders and butchers wore. Not pastry chefs who worked in a restaurant like Vetro. It hung from her neck and crossed over both shoulders and buckled in the back. And when she wore it, she became, structurally, a different silhouette. Broader. More protected. The left shoulder sat slightly higher than the right beneath all that leather, a compensating posture she had calibrated so gradually that she no longer had to think about it. She checked the buckle twice. Old habit. Then she picked up her kit bag. Knife roll, personal pastry tools, the small notebook she used for recipe adjustments. And she walked out of the apartment into the cold. A sec. Vitro occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of the financial district, the kind of neighborhood where the restaurants cost more per plate than most people spend on groceries in a month. The building had been something industrial once, a printing press, according to the placard no one read, and whoever had converted it had been smart enough to keep the exposed brick and the iron ceiling beams and the impractical height of the ceilings, so that the whole dining room felt like eating inside a cathedral dedicated to money and restrained excess. The kitchen was in the back, all stainless steel and relentless overhead lighting, and it was the truest place Noelle had ever worked. She arrived at 4:15. The loading dock in the rear was already receiving deliveries. Dairy, specialty citrus, a crate of Sicilian pistachios she had been waiting on for 3 days. She signed for everything without looking at the delivery driver because she was already calculating in her head how long the pistachios needed to dry before she could grind them, and whether the humidity overnight had affected the ganache she'd left tempering in the lowboy refrigerator. She unlocked the pastry station, turned on the lights, pulled her first set of bowls. This was the part of the day she could breathe, before the rest of the brigade arrived, before the expeditor started running his mouth and the line cooks cranked their music and the servers came through the kitchen with their small crises and their requests for staff meal. Before the whole controlled machinery of a high-end dinner service descended into its particular kind of organized chaos. Before any of that, These 2 hours belonged to her. She worked with her right hand leading on nearly everything, a technique adjustment she had made so incrementally that most people who watched her just assumed she was right-hand dominant to an extreme degree. She was not. She was ambidextrous by training, the way most professional pastry chefs developed bilateral facility over years of practice, because the work demanded it. But she had rewired herself, quietly, over the past 22 months, until her left arm was essentially a support structure and nothing more, so stabilizing a bowl here, bracing a sheet tray there, never the lead, never raised above the midline of her chest, never extended beyond what the injury could bear without announcing itself. The cannoli shells went in first. She had a formula she'd developed over 8 months at Vetro, a proprietary blend of marsala and a small amount of espresso in the dough. A fry temperature she kept 2 degrees lower than conventional recipes, which produced a shell with a slightly darker color and a snap that held longer against the moisture of the ricotta filling. The executive chef, Marco Tillman, had tried to credit himself for the adjustment in a piece a food magazine ran on the restaurant 6 months ago. Noelle had said nothing. She was good at that. By 6:30, the first members of the morning prep team had filtered in. 2 prep cooks who handled stocks and mise en place for the lunch service. A dishwasher named Oscar, who always smelled faintly of cigarettes and brought her black coffee in a paper cup without being asked, which she received like it was something worth protecting. "You sleep?" Oscar asked. "Some," she said. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I appreciate your honesty, Oscar. Just saying." "I know what you're saying." He retreated. She appreciated that too. He knew the borders of a conversation, and he respected them, which was more than she could say for most people. She was piping the ricotta filling, sweetened, strained for 6 hours, folded with hand-cut orange peel and the finest grain of pistachio dust. When she heard the back door open, she didn't look up. Back door opened and closed constantly. But then the kitchen went quiet in a specific way, not the gradual quiet of early morning, the sudden dropped quiet of people who had been talking and then stopped because someone entered the room who made them stop. She looked up. Damiano Vescari was 41 years old and built like someone had designed a man with the intention of making other men feel uncertain about the space they occupied. Not tall in any exceptional way, maybe 6'1", 6'2", but he wore his height differently than most, with a stillness in the shoulders and a way of standing that suggested he had never been required to make himself smaller to fit into any room he had ever entered. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, and he walked through his own kitchen the way a person walks through a room. They own not because they bought it, but because they have simply always been in charge of it. Dark hair, close-cropped, a jaw that looked like it had been introduced to a fist more than once and had not changed its opinion of itself as a result. Dark eyes that moved across the kitchen once, efficiently, cataloging everything in a sweep that lasted maybe 2 seconds, and Noelle had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation that those 2 seconds had included her. She dropped her attention back to the piping bag. She had seen Damiano Vescari precisely 4 times in the 14 months she had worked at Vetro. He was the owner, the name on the lease, the signature on the permits, the face in the business profiles that called him a visionary restaurateur, and mentioned his portfolio of 8 establishments across 3 cities and his preference for staying behind the scenes. He was also, as far as the staff understood it, a man who did not involve himself in the day-to-day operation of a restaurant. He essentially ran as a vanity project, a beautiful, expensive machine that made money for reasons that had nothing to do with the food, or so Noelle had assumed. She heard footsteps cross the kitchen behind her. Stop. The quiet scrape of a stool being pulled from beneath the pastry counter. She kept piping. "What's in those?" His voice was low and unhurried, with an accent that was almost American and not quite something Italian underneath it, not performed, just there. "Cannoli," she said. "Ricotta, orange peel, pistachio. The shells are made in-house." A pause. "I know what cannoli are. I assumed," she said. "I was answering the question." Another pause. She did not look up. "You're the pastry chef." "Yes." "Ashcroft." She looked up then, because something in the way he said the name, flat, certain, like he was confirming information rather than asking, made her attention move without her permission. "That's right," she said. He was looking at the cannoli, not at her. He reached forward and picked one up from the tray she had already plated, not asking, just taking, and bit into it. She watched the shell fracture cleanly, the way it was supposed to. He chewed once, twice, and then set the remaining half down on the edge of the tray with the careful deliberateness of someone who had just registered something unexpected. "Who taught you the temperature adjustment on the shells?" he asked. She felt something shift in her chest. Not a physical thing, something more like the sensation of a floorboard you'd been walking over for a year, suddenly giving a quarter inch beneath your foot. "I developed it here," she said, "through testing." "Not Tillman." It wasn't a question. "No," she said, "not Tillman." He picked up the remaining half of the cannoli and finished it, set the tail of shell down, looked at the tray. Then he looked at her. Actually looked at her, not the food, and his eyes moved in the same way they'd moved when he'd walked into the kitchen, that 2-second catalog that felt thorough in a way that made the back of her neck tighten. "Why are you protecting the man who broke your collarbone?" The piping bag slipped, not fell, slipped a centimeter, enough that a thin line of ricotta dragged across the surface of the shell she'd been filling. Her hands did not shake because she didn't let them. But the thing that happened inside her chest in the half-second between hearing the question and managing her response was something that belonged in the category of free fall. The kitchen was very quiet. She did not speak immediately. She gave herself 3 seconds, which was all she could afford, and in those 3 seconds she ran the calculations. How much he could know, how he could know it, what the correct response was, and found that every answer she reached left her exposed in a different way. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Yes, you do," he said. Not unkindly, just factually, like he was correcting a small error in arithmetic. He stood up from the stool without any further statement, straightened his jacket. His eyes moved to the tray of cannoli once more, and then back to her face. "The shells are good," he said. "Better than the ones we were getting before." And then he walked out of the kitchen. She stood at the pastry counter for approximately 45 seconds after he left, not moving, the piping bag still in her right hand. Oscar appeared at the periphery of her vision with another paper cup of coffee. He set it down without comment and disappeared again, which was the correct response to whatever her face was doing. She resumed working, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, running laps around a question she had no business being asked by anyone in this building, in this city, in any room she had managed to construct for herself over the past 22 months of careful, disciplined silence. She thought about Gavin. She always thought about Gavin when the carefully built architecture of her containment showed a crack. When someone stood too close on the left side, or raised their voice unexpectedly, or asked a question that shouldn't have had an answer anyone else could access. Gavin Mercer was 34 years old and worked for a financial advisory firm in Midtown that had a glass lobby and a receptionist who called clients by their first names and made everyone feel like their money was very safe and very adult. He had a face that photographed well and a handshake that made older men feel trusted. He had been, for 14 months of her life, the person she believed had chosen her out of the entire impossible population of the city, and she had been stupid enough to think that meant something about her value. It had taken 6 months after the first incident for her to understand it would happen again. Another 4 to understand it would keep happening. Another 7 to leave. Not cleanly, not safely, not without a cost she was still paying. The collarbone had been the last thing. Not the last thing he did. The last thing she could hide. She had been in her apartment when it happened, and it happened because she had found something she wasn't supposed to find. A set of account numbers on his laptop, a wire transfer sequence with bank identifiers she didn't recognize, numbers moving in and out of shell companies in an arrangement that made no obvious legitimate sense. She had not been looking for it. She had been using his laptop because hers had died, and she was trying to book a train ticket, and the browser had opened to a tab he hadn't closed. She had been looking at the screen when he walked in. The fall against the door frame had not been an accident, and they both knew it. She had not gone to the hospital. Going to the hospital meant questions, paperwork, a record that could be examined. She had wrapped it herself with athletic tape and the stubborn certainty of someone who had stopped believing that institutions existed to help people who looked like her situation. She had gone to work the next morning because she needed the money, more urgently than she needed most things, because Petra's hospital bills were not going anywhere. Petra was her younger sister, 23, who had spent 4 months the previous year in a neurological unit after a car accident that the other driver's insurance company had so far refused to adequately cover. The bills were not catastrophic in the category of bills that destroyed families immediately. They were the other kind, the slow kind, the kind that came in every month at a number that was almost manageable, if you were extremely careful, and worked every shift available, and ate mostly rice and vegetables, and didn't let yourself think too hard about what the accumulation looked like over time. Noelle was extremely careful. She worked every shift available. She ate rice and vegetables. She had also, for a period of time she was not proud of, stayed in a relationship with a man who paid for dinners and occasionally slid envelopes of cash across tables, and called it supporting her when it was, in fact, a transaction she hadn't understood the full terms of until it was too late. When she left, Gavin had been very clear about what he expected in return for his continued silence. She paid it, every month. A portion of her paycheck transferred on the first to an account he controlled, the justification he'd provided being something about the money he had spent on her sister's care, which was a number Noelle knew was inflated and a debt she had not agreed to and a threat that would collapse her sister's financial stability if she disputed it. She had run the math. She kept running the math. And every time the math came out the same, keep working, keep paying, keep quiet, and eventually the balance would reach zero, and Gavin Mercer would lose interest in a woman who no longer had anything he needed. She was 14 months into a payment plan she had not chosen, and the man who owned this restaurant had just looked at her across a tray of cannoli and asked a question that no one, not her sister, not her closest friend from culinary school who now lived in Portland, not any of the colleagues who had watched her work for over a year, had ever thought to ask. She pressed 2 fingers against the ridge of her collarbone through the leather apron. Hold, release, move on, watch it. She did not see Damiano Vescari again that day. She completed her prep work. She got through the lunch service, which was light on dessert orders. A Tuesday in November. The financial district emptying out early because of something happening at one of the banks a block away. She broke down her station at 3:30, handed off the evening mise en place to the part-time pastry assistant, a culinary school student named James, who was earnest and a little clumsy and genuinely trying, and she felt something almost like affection for him, because he asked questions that had real answers. She walked out through the loading dock and stood in the cold November air and took a breath that reached all the way to the bottom of her lungs for the first time since approximately 7 in the morning. Her phone buzzed. Petra. How was today? Noelle stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed, Fine, same. How's PT going? Petra. Okay. The new exercises are brutal. Also, I talked to the billing office again, and they're saying the adjusted estimate still comes out to what it was before, so... Petra. Don't worry about it. I'm figuring it out. That was the thing about Petra. She always said she was figuring it out, and what she meant was she was waiting for Noelle to figure it out, not because she was careless or entitled, but because she was 23 and had almost died in a car accident and was still relearning how to trust her own body, and the administrative machinery of medical debt was a system designed to exhaust people into compliance. And Noelle was the one with the steady job and the experience navigating systems built to wear you down. Noelle typed, Don't worry, it's covered. She put the phone in her pocket and walked toward the subway. The street was wet from a rain she hadn't registered while she was inside. The city smelled like exhaust and damp concrete, and somewhere, probably from a truck stopped at the light, fried food. A group of office workers moved past her in a cluster, talking too loudly, their voices overlapping in the way of people who had just come from a long lunch and were pretending the afternoon was still going to be productive. She walked with her bag on her right shoulder. Always the right shoulder. Small corrections. Constant. Automatic. She did not think about Damiano Vescari's question on the subway ride home. She thought about it in the elevator of her building. She thought about it while she heated water for pasta. She thought about it with the specific and unproductive quality of a thought that doesn't lead anywhere actionable but refuses to stop circulating. A question that had gotten under the skin of her silence and lodged there like a splinter too deep to reach. How had he known? That was the part that wouldn't settle. She had worked in that kitchen for 14 months. She had been meticulous. She had modified her movement, adjusted her posture, managed her expressions through pain that on certain mornings was vivid enough to make the edges of her vision go white. Her colleagues had noticed nothing. Marco Tillman noticed nothing, and Marco Tillman noticed everything that happened in his kitchen, good or bad, and filed it for later use. Oscar, who watched her more carefully than most people because he was the kind of quiet man who paid attention, had never said a word. Damiano Viscari had been in her kitchen for maybe 8 minutes. She ate the pasta standing at the counter, rinsed the bowl, lay down on the mattress in her clothes, and listened to the radiator knock and thought, for the first time in a very long time, that something had shifted in the careful construction of her ordinary life. And she could not yet determine whether the thing that had shifted was a threat or something else entirely. She was still trying to work that out when she fell asleep. Bossy. The next morning, she arrived at 4:12, 3 minutes earlier than usual, for no reason she could consciously explain. She unlocked the pastry station, turned on the lights, pulled her bowls. She had been working for 40 minutes when she became aware, with the specific animal precision of someone who had spent 22 months calibrating threat detection, that she was not alone. She did not startle. She set down the whisk she was holding, very deliberately, and turned. Damiano Viscari was sitting on the same stool he had occupied the morning before. He was in a different suit, navy this time, the jacket hanging open, the same white shirt without a tie, and he was holding a small espresso cup that he must have made himself because no one else was in the kitchen yet. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't classify. Not pity, not the particular softness people deployed when they were about to say something they thought was compassionate, something more neutral than that, and somehow more direct. "I didn't ask you a question yesterday to make you uncomfortable," he said. "All right," she said. "I asked because I already knew the answer." She looked at him. Her hands, loose at her sides, were very still. "That's not possible," she said. "Tell me why." "Because there's nothing to know." "Noelle." He said her name the way he'd said her last name the previous morning. Flat, certain, like he was placing a fact on a table. "I've been watching this kitchen for 14 months. Not you specifically. The kitchen. Everything that moves through it." He set the espresso cup down. "You modify every task that requires your left arm. You brace against the counter when someone moves too fast near your left side. You bought an apron designed to redistribute the visual weight of your shoulders because the left sits higher than it should. You've been doing all of this long enough that you don't think about it anymore." Silence. "I run 14 restaurants," he said. "I know what healthy looks like in a kitchen. I know what someone managing something looks like. You've been managing something since before you came to work here." She crossed her arms, right over left, her standard posture, the left hand tucked close against her body. "Even if any of that were true," she said, "it's not your concern." "Maybe not," he said. "There's no maybe. It's not." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, like he was accepting a position he would revisit later. "The cannoli are going on the permanent menu," he said, "starting Thursday. Your credit, not Tillman's." And he left again. She thought, in the days that followed, that it would stop there. She wanted it to stop there. She had constructed her life specifically to be a thing that moved forward without intervention, a machine that ran on discipline and small economies, and the willful suppression of anything that looked like hope. And the presence of someone who saw through the machinery was not, as she initially insisted to herself, a relief. It was a threat of a different kind. She told herself this while she made the financiers for Thursday's service, and while she adjusted the caramel for the panna cotta, and while she trained James on the proper tempering curve for dark chocolate, which he kept rushing because he was 22 and had not yet learned that chocolate, like most things that mattered, could not be hurried without consequence. She told herself this when she noticed, 4 days after the second conversation, that there were 2 men she had never seen before stationed at the far end of the loading dock during her morning arrivals. They were dressed like delivery personnel. They were not delivery personnel. She knew this because real delivery personnel checked their clipboards and moved boxes and talked on the phone to dispatchers. These men stood still in the particular alert way of people who had been placed somewhere for a specific purpose. She told herself this when she mentioned the men to Oscar, obliquely, and Oscar looked at her with the expression of a man who had worked in this building long enough to know that there were questions you asked and questions you didn't. "Don't worry about it," Oscar said. That's not an answer. "It's the only one I've got." She wanted to be angry about it. She was angry about it. She was angry about being watched, carefully, discreetly, but watched, by a man she had not asked for help, concerning a problem she was handling in the only way available to her, and the anger was clean and reasonable and entirely correct. The thing she did not let herself look at directly, the thing she kept in her peripheral vision and refused to confront, was the possibility that the anger was easier to sustain than the alternative. Because the alternative, someone seeing her, actually seeing her, and choosing to act on what they saw, was something she had no framework for anymore. She had dismantled that framework 22 months ago against a door frame with the sound of something structural giving way, and she had rebuilt herself around its absence, and the presence of something that looked like it from this angle was something her nervous system did not know how to process as safe. She kept working. She kept paying the transfer on the first of the month. She kept moving through the kitchen with her left arm held close and her right leading on everything and her heavy apron buckled tight. And she kept arriving before sunrise and kept making the cannoli that had gone on the permanent menu with her name, or rather with no name, because Damiano had added them to the menu as house-made cannoli and had not, in the end, credited anyone. And she kept doing what she was good at, which was producing beautiful things from precise processes and keeping everything that was broken well out of sight. Until the third morning he came in. This time he did not sit. He stood at the far end of the pastry station with his coffee, watching her work, and after several minutes of silence, he said, without any preliminary, "Gavin Mercer." She stopped, set the scraper down, turned to face him completely for the first time in any of these conversations. "Say that again," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "Gavin Mercer," he repeated, "financial advisor, licensed in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Client roster that includes 11 private wealth accounts, 3 of which are structured as pass-through entities." He paused. "You know what a pass-through entity is?" "Yes," she said. "Then you know those 3 accounts are not what they're listed as." She looked at him. The kitchen was empty around them. The early morning light was gray through the high window above the dish station. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm telling you what I know." "Why?" "Because you deserve to know that someone knows it." "That's not a reason." He looked at her without any change in his expression. "You've been making monthly transfers to an account he controls. You've been doing it since you left. He told you it was repayment. It isn't. It's leverage. He's keeping you afraid and compliant because you know something about those accounts, even if you don't understand what you know. And he can't afford for you to stop being afraid." The room had gotten very small. "You've been investigating me," she said. "I've been investigating him," Damiano said. "You were adjacent." "That is such a—" She stopped, pressed her right hand flat against the counter. "You have no right." "No," he agreed. "I don't." "Then why?" He set his coffee cup down. When he spoke, his voice was exactly the same, low, unhurried, factually precise. But something in it had shifted by 1 degree. "Because someone walked into my kitchen and broke something that belonged to me," he said, "and I don't mean the collarbone." She stared at him. "He hurt you in a building I run," Damiano said, "on property that carries my name. And he's been controlling you inside the orbit of everything I own for 14 months. And I have never—" He paused, the first real pause in the rhythm of his speech. "I don't allow that. Not in my houses. Not to anyone who works in them." It was the wrong thing for her to feel, given everything. But standing in that kitchen in the 4:30 dark, with the radiator ticking in the wall and the cannoli shells cooling on the rack, and this man looking at her like she was something that had been handled carelessly by someone who should have known better, she felt briefly, furiously, like something in her chest was giving way. She turned back to her work. "I don't need your protection," she said. "I know you don't," he said. I'm not a problem you get to solve because it offended your sense of jurisdiction," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." "I know what you were going to say." She wheeled around. "Then stop finishing my sentences." He didn't smile. His face didn't change at all. But something in the dark eyes shifted, registered, noted, filed. "The men at the loading dock," she said. "Pull them." "No," he said. "Excuse me?" "They stay." His voice did not rise, did not tighten, just stated the fact with the calm of a man who was accustomed to saying things once. "Until I decide they don't need to." She stared at him for a long moment. The anger was real and justified and entirely insufficient against the wall of his composure. "You don't own me," she said. "No," he said, "but I do own the building." He left. She stood at the counter and breathed through the anger and the other thing underneath it that she refused to name, and then she turned back to her shells and her filling and the precise, controllable architecture of her work. Outside, down the hall, she heard the back door close. Somewhere in the building, she knew without looking, two men stood at the end of a loading dock in the pre-dawn cold. She pressed two fingers against her collarbone. Hold. She thought about Gavin getting a wire transfer notification on the 1st of the month. The way he probably didn't even look at it anymore, probably just checked to confirm the number was right and went back to whatever he was doing. The way she had become to him such a certainty that he'd stopped thinking about her except as a recurring line item. She thought about the account numbers on the laptop screen, about the bank identifiers she'd memorized without meaning to, the way she memorized everything. Recipes, measurements, the precise temperature at which a sugar syrup became brittle, because her mind filed things automatically and permanently, whether she wanted it to or not. She had never told anyone what she'd seen on that screen. She had never considered telling anyone, because the calculus was simple. You spoke and you put Petra at risk, or you stayed quiet and you stayed in control of the only variable you could control. But Damiano Viscari had looked at her across a tray of cannoli and asked a question no one else had thought to ask, and had come back the next morning with the name of the man she was afraid of, and had said something about broken things and his buildings, and a concept she refused to examine too closely. And now there were two men at the loading dock who were there because of her, specifically, and none of the equations she had been using for 22 months were producing the same results anymore. Release. She picked up the piping bag. She had orders to fill. Gavin called at 9:17 that evening. She was at the kitchen table with her notebook, working through a new flavor pairing she'd been testing in her head all day, black sesame with white chocolate, which was risky and interesting and might work, when the phone screen lit up with his name. She answered on the second ring because she had learned that answering late made things worse. "I heard something interesting today," Gavin said. His voice was the kind of pleasant that had a floor beneath it, smooth surface over cold concrete. "What did you hear?" she said. Not a question. "That you've been spending a lot of time with Damiano Viscari." She said nothing. "Noel." "I work in his restaurant, Gavin. I've spoken to him twice." "About what?" "The menu." She kept her voice flat. He had questions about the pastry program. A silence on the other end that she had learned to read the way meteorologists learn to read certain clouds. Not by what they showed, but by what they meant. "You know, I've always trusted you," Gavin said. "I've been very generous with you, considering. I just want to make sure that trust isn't being misplaced." "It isn't." "Good. That's good to hear." Another pause. "How's Petra?" Noelle's hand tightened on the phone. "She's fine," she said. "Good. You tell her I was asking." The line went dead. She set the phone face down on the table, stared at the wall above the stove. Her notebook was open to a half-sketched diagram of flavor relationships. Black sesame in the center, lines radiating outward to white chocolate, miso, vanilla, burnt sugar. And the diagram looked for a moment like a threat assessment rather than a recipe. He knew she'd been near Damiano. She didn't know how. A front-of-house employee who passed the information along, a client of his who ate at Vetro and saw something. The simple statistical reality of a city where information moved in ways you couldn't track and couldn't stop. He knew, and he had deployed Petra's name in the calm, pleasant way he always deployed her name. Not as a threat exactly, just as a reminder that there were things in Noelle's world that were soft and unprotected and within reach. She sat at the table for a long time, then she turned the notebook to a clean page. At the top she wrote, in the precise small handwriting she used for recipe measurements, account numbers, and below it, from a memory she had spent 22 months trying not to use, she wrote down every identifier, every routing number, every sequence she had seen on that laptop screen before the world rearranged itself against a door frame. She did not know what she was going to do with it. She only knew that she was done being a certainty. She closed the notebook, set it on the table, went to the window and looked down at the street below, where a cab was idling at the light and a couple was arguing in front of the bodega on the corner with the specific exhausted passion of two people who had been arguing the same argument for years. Somewhere across the city, Gavin Mercer was doing whatever Gavin Mercer did in the evenings. Dinner with clients, paperwork, the pleasant surface life of a man who had never had to worry about anyone examining the structure underneath. Somewhere in a building on the eastern edge of the financial district, two men she didn't know stood at the end of a loading dock in the November cold. And somewhere, she didn't know where, didn't need to know, refused to care, Damiano Viscari was very likely making a decision she hadn't been consulted about. She stood at the window until the cab pulled away, and the couple resolved their argument into something that looked, from 4 floors above, like an exhausted truce. Then she went to bed. She lay on her back and stared at the water stain on the ceiling. In the morning, she would get up, she would buckle the apron, she would make the shells at the right temperature and pipe the filling with the orange peel and the pistachio dust, and she would be exactly what she had been for 14 months. Disciplined, precise, contained, invisible. She would do all of that. But the notebook was still on the table, and the numbers were still on the page. And something that had been locked for 22 months had, in the past 3 mornings, developed a crack that she could feel, not in the collarbone, not this time, but somewhere deeper and less anatomical, somewhere that did not have a name yet, but that she recognized with the certainty of someone who had spent too long carrying something alone and had just, for the first time, set it down for 30 seconds. She had picked it back up, but the weight of it felt different now. That was the thing she was least prepared for. Boom. She didn't know it yet, couldn't have known it, but at that exact moment, 43 blocks away, a man who had just ended a call with a private investigator was sitting at a desk in an office that had no windows and was looking at a report that contained Noelle Ashcroft's home address, her sister's physical therapy schedule, and the registration details of the vehicle she no longer owned, but that was still listed in her name. Gavin Mercer was not a man who made threats he didn't intend to keep. He was, however, a man who had recently become very interested in what Noelle might have said, or shown, or handed to someone inside that restaurant, and he had decided that the monthly transfer arrangement, generous as it had been, was no longer sufficient. He needed something more direct. He picked up his phone. He made a call. The notebook stayed on the table overnight. Noelle knew this because she checked it at 2:43 in the morning when she got up for water, standing in the dark kitchen in her socks, and looked at the closed cover like it might have changed while she slept. It hadn't. It was still a cheap spiral notebook with a black cover and her handwriting inside and a set of numbers that could, depending on who looked at them and what they decided to do, either save her or finish what Gavin had started 22 months ago against a door frame. She drank the water, went back to bed. Did not sleep again. By 3:30 she was dressed and moving. The subway at that hour was nearly empty. A sanitation worker asleep against the window, a group of young men still out from the night before, loud in the way of people who hadn't yet been told the evening was over. She sat near the door with her bag on her lap and her right hand resting on top of it, and she stared at the black tunnel glass and thought about Gavin's voice on the phone, the pleasant surface of it. "How's Petra?" 2 words deployed like a scalpel. She had been underestimating how cornered she was. That was the thing she'd been getting wrong. She had been thinking of her situation as a controlled problem, finite, manageable, moving towards zero. She had been thinking of Gavin as a man who had gotten what he wanted and would leave her alone once the debt was cleared. She understood now at 3:50 in the morning on a near-empty subway car, operating on an assumption that was 22 months out of date. Men like Gavin Mercer did not let go of leverage. They accumulated it. She arrived at the restaurant to find Oscar already there, which was unusual. He was standing at the loading dock with a paper cup in each hand and an expression she had never seen on his face before, a compression around the eyes, something careful and measuring, and he held one of the cups out to her as she came up the steps. "Early," she said. "Yeah," he said. She took the cup. "Why?" He glanced down the dock toward the far end, where the 2 men she'd noticed before were standing in the cold. Then he looked back at her. "Someone came by last night," he said. "After close." She went still. "What do you mean, came by?" "I mean came by." He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "Walked the perimeter. Looked at the doors. Didn't come in. He paused. Marco called it in. To the police? Oscar looked at her with an expression that was very patient and very flat. Right, she said. Not the police. She understood. There were things that happened in the orbit of this building that did not go to the police, and she had known this in the abstract, peripheral way she knew many things about Vetro. Held at a distance, not examined, set aside in the category of not her concern. She was a pastry chef. She made cannoli. The rest of the machinery was someone else's business, except now it wasn't. Now it was sitting on the loading dock with her at 4 in the morning, and it had a face and a voice, and it had said, "How's Petra?" in a tone that did not require any further elaboration. The man who runs this place, she said. Vescari. She stopped. Yeah, Oscar said. He's not just a restaurateur. Oscar drank his coffee, said nothing. Oscar, what do you want me to say, Noelle? I want you to tell me what I'm actually working inside of. He looked at her for a long moment. A truck passed on the street below the dock, its headlights sweeping briefly across them and then gone. I want you to tell me, he said carefully, that whoever came by last night has nothing to do with you. She said nothing. He closed his eyes, opened them. Go make your pastry, he said, and stay inside the building today, all day. Don't go out for anything. That's not... Noelle. His voice was quiet and final. Go inside. She went inside. She set up her station with the particular mechanical focus of someone who needed their hands to be doing something their brain could supervise without actually being present. Flour, butter. The weight of each ingredient entered into the scale with her right hand while her left pressed lightly against the edge of the counter. At 6:45, Damiano walked in. Not from the back this time. From the interior, the door that connected the kitchen to the service corridor that ran the length of the building. He came in with another man, someone she hadn't seen before, who was large and quiet in the specific way of people who were professionally large and quiet, and who stopped at the door while Damiano crossed to the pastry station. She did not look up. The perimeter check last night, she said. I know about it. It was someone connected to Gavin Mercer. I know that too. She looked up. How long have you known? Since about 11 last night. And you didn't tell me. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite something else. Something that occupied the space between the two. I'm telling you now, he said. That's not the same thing. No, it isn't. She set the dough scraper down, turned to face him fully. I need to understand what is happening in this building that I apparently work inside of without knowing the full context of. What do you think is happening? I think, she said, that you are not a restaurateur. I think this building functions as something more than a restaurant. And I think that whatever it is, whatever the actual structure is, it intersects with Gavin Mercer in a way that goes beyond him wanting to know whether I've been talking to you. Damiano said nothing. He launders money, she said. I know that. I saw it on his laptop before he... She stopped. I have the account numbers. I've had them for 2 years. I didn't know who to give them to, or whether giving them to anyone would keep Petra safe, or whether I was even interpreting what I saw correctly. But I have them. The kitchen was very quiet. The large man at the door had not moved. Damiano looked at her for a long time. Not the catalog look, not the 2-second assessment. Something slower and less comfortable than that. Which organizations, he said. She blinked. What? The accounts. Which organizations were receiving the transfers? I recognized some of the names, some I didn't. Say the ones you recognized. She said 3 names. 2 of them meant nothing to her beyond what she had later found in news articles, crime families, federal indictments, the dry language of organized crime reporting that described things at such a remove that the reality of them barely registered. The 3rd name made Damiano go very still, not visibly. His face didn't change, his posture didn't change, but something, the quality of the air around him, the way the large man at the door straightened almost imperceptibly, shifted. Say that again, Damiano said. She said it again. He turned away from her, walked to the far end of the counter, stood with his back to her for a moment that lasted long enough for her to count her own heartbeats, 4, 5, 6, and then turned back, He's been moving money for the Carrera Syndicate, he said. I don't know what that is. I know you don't. He crossed back to where she was standing. The Carrera Syndicate operates out of Miami and has been attempting to establish distribution infrastructure in this city for approximately 3 years. I have been, he paused precisely, involved in preventing that. She stared at him. Gavin Mercer, she said slowly, has been laundering money for people who are in direct conflict with you. Yes. And you knew about this before you ever asked me about my collarbone? I knew about Mercer's operations in general terms. I didn't know the specific accounts. I didn't know the Carrera connection. I didn't know what you'd seen on his laptop. He looked at her steadily. I found out about the collarbone because I noticed the collarbone. Those are 2 different investigations. She turned away from him, pressed both hands flat against the counter. The right and then the left. The left that sent a dull flare of pain up through her shoulder that she absorbed without expression. The man who came by last night, she said. He wasn't checking the building. He was looking for a way in. Yes. Because Gavin thinks I've told you about the accounts. Almost certainly. Has he told the Carrera people that I might have? That, Damiano said, is what I'm currently trying to determine. She absorbed this. The kitchen around her was the same kitchen it had always been. The same stainless steel, the same fluorescent white, the same smells of butter and sugar, and the industrial detergent the cleaning crew used on the floors. But it was a different room than it had been 72 hours ago, and she was a different person standing in it, and the apron buckled across her chest felt, for the first time, less like protection and more like armor that she had been wearing in the wrong war. I need to know, she said, that Petra is safe. She will be. That's not what I said. I said I need to know. He looked at her. Where is she? Brooklyn, Greenpoint. She has a physical therapy appointment at 2 this afternoon at a clinic on Manhattan Avenue. He turned slightly toward the door and said 2 words to the large man, too low for her to hear, and the man nodded and stepped out. She watched this happen, felt something inside her chest register it in a way she wasn't equipped to process cleanly. What are you going to do about Gavin? She said. What I should have done before I started asking you questions in a pastry kitchen. That's not an answer. It's all the answer you need right now. She turned on him. The anger was immediate and specific, and she let it out because she was exhausted and frightened in a way she hadn't been for 2 years and had no patience left for the particular arrogance of men who thought that doing the right thing on their own terms absolved them of the obligation to include you in the decision. Don't do that, she said. Don't decide what I need to know. You have been making decisions about my situation without asking me from the moment you sat down on that stool, and I'm telling you clearly, I am not a variable in your operation. I am a person who has been managing a very specific and very dangerous situation for 2 years, and I am still here. I am still standing, and I deserve to know what is happening. He let her finish. Then he said, You're right. She hadn't expected that. It stopped her cold in a way that the argument hadn't. Mercer has become a liability to the Carrera organization, he said, which means they will either pull him out and cut the connection, or they will use him to remove anyone who might testify about the financial structure. You are, at this point, the only person outside their organization who has seen those accounts. That makes you a target, not from Mercer specifically, but from the people whose money Mercer moves. She heard it. She processed it. She did not flinch because she had learned not to. How long, she said, before they decide which option to take? Days, maybe less. The dough on the counter needed to be refrigerated. She picked it up, wrapped it, placed it in the lowboy. Small, ordinary gesture. Her hands were steady. The notebook, she said. I wrote the account numbers down last night. Where is it? My apartment, kitchen table. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a phone on the counter. A different phone from the kind she would have expected. Simple, unbranded. Call your building super. Tell him you need someone to go in and retrieve something from your table. I'll handle the rest. I'm not involving my super in Noel. He placed his hand flat on the counter beside hers. Not touching, just there. I need those numbers today. Not tomorrow. Today. Whatever method you're comfortable with, use it, but get them out of that apartment. She looked at the phone, then at his hand beside hers on the counter, then at his face. Who are you? She said, and she meant it as a real question. Not the rhetorical kind, not the kind people asked when they meant, "What do you think you're doing?" But the actual question, the one about what kind of person she was looking at, and whether the things he had done in the past several days placed him in the category of danger or the other thing, the thing she didn't have a reliable name for anymore. He looked back at her without moving. "The kind of man," he said, "who does not allow the people inside his buildings to be hurt." That's not an answer either. "No," he said. "It isn't." He picked up the phone and held it out. After a moment, she took it. She called her neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, who was 71 and retired and had a key to Noelle's apartment for plant watering emergencies, and who asked no questions when Noelle said she'd left something important on the kitchen table, and could Mrs. Callahan put it in an envelope and hold it until someone came by to pick it up. Mrs. Callahan said of course she'd been up since 5, and she'd put the kettle on while she was at it. Noelle gave the address to the large man, whose name, she learned, was Caruso, and who had returned from whatever errand Damiano had sent him on, with the brief confirmation that Petra's physical therapy clinic was, as of that morning, covered. She did not ask what covered meant. She thought about asking. She decided not to, because the answer was likely something she needed to place in the category of not examining too closely, and she had already exceeded her limit for revelations in a single morning. She went back to work. The kitchen filled gradually around her. Prep cooks, the morning sous chef, James arriving 12 minutes late with flour on his jacket from a stop at the bakery on his block, which he mentioned unprompted and no one responded to. Marco Tillman came in at 9, made a performance of tasting everything within reach, and stopped at the pastry station long enough to tell Noelle that a food writer from a national publication was coming in for the Wednesday dinner service, and he expected the dessert program to perform. "When doesn't it?" she said. He looked at her. She looked back. He moved on. The morning service passed. The lunch rush. She worked through both with the focused automation of someone whose hands knew what to do and whose mind was running a separate parallel process on a different set of inputs. At 2:15, Caruso appeared at the pastry station and placed Mrs. Callahan's envelope on the counter without comment. Noelle looked at it, picked it up, put it in her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said. Caruso nodded and was gone. Damiano came back at 4. Not in the kitchen this time. He sent James to tell her there was something in the office she needed to sign, which was clearly pretextual because she had never been asked to sign anything in the office in 14 months. But she followed James to the door of the administrative office at the back of the building, and James knocked and was told to go, and she went inside. The office was small and practical. A desk, a set of filing cabinets, a window that looked at a brick wall. Damiano was standing at the desk. Caruso was in the corner. There was a third man she hadn't seen before, older, in a gray suit, who had the air of someone accustomed to rooms where decisions were made. Damiano looked at her. "This is Holden. He works with federal investigators in a consulting capacity." The man in the gray suit nodded at her without standing. "He needs the account numbers," Damiano said, "and he needs a statement about what you saw on Mercer's laptop, when and where and what the screen showed." She stood in the doorway, looked at Holden, then at Damiano. "If I do this," she said. "Petra is protected," Damiano said. "Financially and physically. The debt Mercer claimed is documented as fraudulent. You will not owe him another transfer. And me? Witness coordination. There are protocols. I'm not disappearing into a protocol, Damiano." It was the first time she'd used his name. She heard it land in the room, not dramatically, but with a small, specific weight that changed the temperature slightly. "You don't have to disappear anywhere," he said. "You stay where you are. You keep your job. The investigation runs through channels that don't require you to be present for most of it. When it comes to testimony, Holden handles the preparation." She looked at Holden. "Is that accurate?" "For the most part," Holden said. His voice was dry and economical. "There are variables. I appreciate that you said that instead of just saying yes. I don't have a reason to mislead you." She looked at the envelope in her hand. 22 months of silence. A bone that had healed wrong. A sister who said, "Don't worry about it," when she meant, "I need you to fix this." Transfers on the 1st of every month into an account that belonged to a man who had said, "How's Petra?" and meant, "Remember what I can reach." She opened the envelope, took out the notebook, set it on the desk. "Page 12, she said. "Everything's there." Holden reached for the notebook. She put her hand on it. I need your word, she said, looking at Damiano, not Holden. Not a protocol. Your word. He looked at her. Petra doesn't get touched, she said. Not by Mercer, not by whoever he works for, not by any of the fallout from whatever comes next. You give me that. You have it, he said. She lifted her hand. Holden took the notebook. She was back at her station by 4:30. The evening prep was already behind because James had overmixed the chocolate mousse and it was beginning to separate, and she fixed it with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been correcting other people's mistakes for as long as she could remember, folding it back together with a spatula and the precise wrist motion that could not be rushed without making everything worse. James watched her. How do you always know? Know what? When something's wrong. You walked in and you just knew. She set the spatula down. Because I've broken the same thing enough times that I recognize it. He nodded like she'd said something profound. She hadn't meant it that way. She'd meant it literally. The evening service built and crested and broke around her, the way it always did. The specific controlled violence of a professional kitchen at full capacity. Heat and noise and Marco's voice carrying across the line, the clatter of plates, the tickets printing in a continuous papery percussion. She plated 6 dessert variations across 4 hours, and she plated them cleanly, and she did not think about Holden and the notebook and the consultation that was, presumably, occurring somewhere in this building or in a car outside it or in an office she would never enter. She thought instead about Gavin, not about what she felt about him. She had done that work already. Ugly, private work, done mostly at 4 in the morning in the months after she left. And she had come out the other side of it with something that wasn't exactly peace, but was at least a territory she could move through without bleeding. She thought about him strategically, the way she thought about a dough that was behaving incorrectly. What was its current state? What did it need? What was the risk if she misread it? His current state. Afraid. Not of her. Of the Carrera syndicate, who would view his exposure as an unacceptable liability. Of Damiano, whose interest in Noelle he had incorrectly interpreted as pillow talk information sharing rather than whatever it actually was. Of the account numbers, which were now on page 12 of a spiral notebook in the hands of a federal consultant in a building Gavin had sent someone to case the night before. What he needed to know she hadn't talked, to reassure himself that the situation was still contained, what he would do if he decided it wasn't, the question she had been not thinking about all day, the one that sat at the edge of everything else like a cliff edge she was navigating around. She was plating the last order of the night, a panna cotta with the caramel she'd adjusted twice this week, set beautifully, the surface catching the light the way liquid amber caught light, when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Not a call. A text. She couldn't check it mid-plate. She finished the panna cotta, set it in the pass, wiped her hands, pulled out the phone. The number was one she didn't recognize. Not Gavin's number, not any number in her contacts. The text was 4 words. We need to meet. She stared at it. Then, below it, a second message from the same number. Vetro. Tonight. After close. Come alone or I go to your sister's building instead. Her vision went very sharp in the specific way it went sharp when her nervous system registered something it had been trained to recognize. She read the messages twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and looked at the kitchen around her. The end of service winding down, the line cooks breaking down their stations, James carefully wrapping the leftover mousse, Oscar loading the dish machine. Caruso was not in the kitchen. She did not know where Damiano was. She stood very still for a moment in the loud, ordinary end of an evening service, and she thought about the message. And she thought about Petra's building in Greenpoint. And she thought about the precise and deliberate way Gavin Mercer had always known which lever to press. And she made a calculation that she knew, even as she made it, was the kind of calculation you made when you were out of... She didn't tell Caruso. That was the decision she made in the 30 seconds she stood at the end of the pass, with the phone in her pocket and the kitchen breaking down around her. She did not tell Caruso. She did not find Damiano. She did not hand the problem to anyone else's hands. Because the message had said, come alone, and she had spent enough time reading Gavin Mercer's communications to know that the qualifier was not rhetorical. He meant it the way he meant everything, as a condition with consequences attached, and the consequence this time had a specific address in Greenpoint and a physical therapy schedule and a name. She texted back one word. When? The response came in under a minute. Midnight, kitchen door. She put the phone away. Finished breaking down her station. Helped James with the moose storage because his hands were shaking slightly, probably caffeine, probably exhaustion, and she showed him the correct way to press plastic wrap against the surface to prevent a skin without saying anything about the trembling. She wiped the counter. She hung her apron on its hook. She told Oscar goodnight. He looked at her. You all right? Tired, she said. He looked at her for one more second with the eyes of a man who had seen enough to know the difference between tired and something else. And then he let it go because she had given him nothing to hold, and he was too experienced to grasp at air. She left through the front. She walked 2 blocks and then stopped in the doorway of a closed pharmacy and stood in the cold for several minutes. The street was quiet in the way of financial district streets after 10. Not empty, just purposeful. The people moving through it all going somewhere specific with no interest in anything adjacent to their route. She thought about what she was doing. She thought about it the way she thought about a technical problem in the kitchen. Not emotionally, not with the part of her brain that ran on fear, but with the flat analytical part that had kept her functional for 2 years. What did she have? What did she need? What was the acceptable risk? What she had? A meeting that Gavin had called on his terms, on his timeline, at a location he'd chosen because it was familiar to her and presumably easier to control than a neutral site. He'd chosen the restaurant, which meant he was either very confident or very desperate. And in her experience, those 2 states in Gavin Mercer produced the same external behavior and different underlying calculations. What she needed, to know what he actually wanted. The message had said, "We need to meet." Not "you're done." Not the kind of language he used when he had already decided on an outcome. Which meant he hadn't decided yet. Which meant there was still something she could affect. What was the acceptable risk? She didn't know. That was the honest answer. She didn't know because she had handed the notebook to Holden 4 hours ago, and she didn't know what had happened since, and she didn't know whether Gavin knew about the notebook or only suspected that she'd talked. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between a conversation she could navigate and one she couldn't. She stood in the pharmacy doorway for 8 minutes. Then she walked back to the restaurant. She didn't go inside. She went around to the alley beside the building and sat on the concrete step above the storm drain and waited, because if she went inside, she would have to walk past the office where Damiano or Caruso or both might still be. And she had made a decision she wasn't certain would survive contact with either of them. At 11:43, the alley was very quiet. At 11:51, she heard footsteps on the pavement at the far end. She stood. Gavin Mercer came into the alley with one other man she didn't recognize. Large leather jacket, the kind of face that had learned not to express anything. Gavin himself looked, as he always looked, like a photograph of a person rather than the person. The suit was good, the hair was right, the jaw was set in the particular way that meant he had rehearsed the conversation he was about to have. He stopped 6 feet from her. "You came alone," he said. "You told me to." "I did." He looked at her with the flat assessment she remembered from the worst moments of the time they'd spent together. "You look tired, Noelle." "What do you want, Gavin?" "I want to have a conversation like 2 adults." He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "I want to know what you told Viscari." "I told him about the pastry program. He owns the restaurant." Stop. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was one of the things that had taken her so long to understand. The danger was always in the flatness, not the volume. "I sent someone to look at this building 2 nights ago. You know why?" "No." "Because the day before, a contact of mine saw federal marshals running a plate in this block. A plate connected to a consulting firm that does work for the DOJ. He tilted his head slightly. "Interesting coincidence." Her face did not move. "I made a mistake," he said. "I thought you were smart enough to be afraid and not smart enough to act on it. That was my error. I'm correcting it now." He pulled one hand from his pocket. No weapon, just his hand, open, gestured toward her in the way of someone making a reasonable point. "Tell me what you gave them." "I didn't give anyone anything." "The account numbers, Noelle." She kept her breathing even. "I don't know what you mean." "You saw them on my laptop 2 years ago." He said it with the weariness of someone reading back a fact that had been established long ago. I know you memorize them. You memorize everything, recipes, measurements, numbers. It's how your brain works. I noticed it in the first month. He paused. I've been waiting 2 years for you to use them. The cold air off the pavement smelled like wet concrete and old food from the restaurant dumpster 10 feet away. She was aware of these things with the hyperclarity of a nervous system running very hot, every detail registering at full resolution. If I had given anything to anyone, she said, you wouldn't be here asking. You'd already know. Something moved behind his eyes. Not certainty. Recalculation. She pressed it. You're here because you don't know, because you're not sure. And if the people you work for thought you'd lost control of a liability this size, you'd have a different kind of problem than me. His jaw tightened by 1 degree. So what you actually want, she said, is for me to tell you it's fine, that I kept my mouth shut, so you can go back to whoever and say the situation is contained. He looked at her for a long moment. You've gotten harder, he said. 2 years of practice. It doesn't suit you. I disagree. The large man in the leather jacket shifted his weight behind Gavin's right shoulder, not moving, just reminding her he existed. I need the numbers, Gavin said. Whatever you wrote down, whatever you told them, I need to know the scope. There's no scope. There's nothing. Noelle. He took 1 step forward. I have been patient with you for 2 years, very patient. The arrangement we have isn't an arrangement, she said. It's extortion. His face went very still. I know that's what it is, she said. I've known for a long time. I paid it because I was protecting Petra, and I didn't have another option. But you standing in this alley at midnight tells me the balance of power in this situation has shifted, and you came here because you need something from me, which means I'm not the one without options anymore. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then Gavin said quietly, I want you to think very carefully about the next thing you say. I have. You have a sister with outstanding medical debt and a physical therapy schedule that takes her to the same block every Tuesday and Thursday. I know where my sister goes. Then you understand that the conversation we're having right now has consequences that go beyond you. Her hands were very still at her sides. Everything in her chest was loud. None of it was visible. So here's what's going to happen, Gavin said. You're going to tell me exactly what Viscari knows. And then you're going to help me understand how those federal consultants got pointed at this block. And then we're going to renegotiate our arrangement in a way that reflects your new understanding of what cooperation looks like. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the face she had once read as trustworthy, at the jaw she had once read as strength, at the eyes she now recognized as the eyes of a man who had never once encountered a consequence he couldn't purchase his way out of and had organized his entire personality around that fact. No, she said. He blinked, just once. I'm not telling you anything, she said. I'm not renegotiating anything, and I want you to leave this building. The large man in the leather jacket took a step forward. At that exact moment, the kitchen door opened. Dim. The light from inside the restaurant fell across the alley in a yellow rectangle, and Damiano Viscari walked through it and stopped, and for 1 full second, nobody moved. Then Caruso came through the door behind him, and another man Noelle hadn't seen before, and then a fourth who positioned himself at the alley entrance without being directed to do so. Damiano looked at Noelle, then at Gavin, then back at Noelle, and the look was not the catalog look and not the flat factual look. It was something that moved through his face like weather, quick and then gone, leaving the surface as composed as it had been before. He said nothing to her. He looked at Gavin. Do you know whose employee you just touched? He said. His voice was exactly the same as it was in a kitchen at 4 a.m, low, unhurried, a fact being placed on a table. Gavin stared at him. The recognition was coming. Noelle could see it. The name Viscari, assembling itself in Gavin's mind from whatever fragments he had, the business profiles, the restaurant portfolio, and then something else, something beneath that, something his financial clients had told him or he had read in whatever circles he moved in. And she watched the recognition arrive in his face, and then watched something happen underneath it that was less readable but more significant. He laughed. It came out slightly wrong, too high, too quick, but he committed to it. Viscari, he said, you run a restaurant. I run 14, Damiano said. And you've appointed yourself this woman's, what, her guardian? Damiano looked at him with an expression that had no category Noel could find in any taxonomy of human response. It wasn't contempt, exactly. It wasn't anger. It was something colder and more structural than either, the look of a man identifying a problem and calculating the most efficient solution. He said, I don't think you understand where you're standing. I'm standing in an alley. You're standing in mine. The large man in the leather jacket looked at Caruso. Caruso looked back. Neither moved, but the quality of their stillness changed in a way that Noel registered across the surface of her skin. Gavin straightened his jacket, looked at Noel. This isn't over. It will be, Damiano said. Still to Gavin, not to her. Walk out of my alley. Gavin looked at him for a long moment, with the face of a man performing calm over something that was no longer calm. Then he turned and walked toward the alley entrance. The large man followed. The fourth man Noel hadn't seen before stepped aside to let them pass and then back into position, and they were gone. The silence that followed had texture. She could feel it against her skin. Damiano turned to her. She spoke first because she was not going to stand here and receive whatever he was about to say without having said something herself. I know I should have told you. Yes, he said. He threatened Petra. I know. I thought if I came alone I could... She stopped. The sentence didn't have an end that made sense. She had not, she understood now with the cold clarity of aftermath, thought past the first 30 seconds of the encounter. She had run the calculation wrong. Damiano crossed the space between them in 4 steps. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly, and he looked at her face in the low light with an expression that was not soft, because nothing about him was soft, but it was something she had not seen from him before and could not immediately name. Are you hurt? He said. No. He looked at her left shoulder. No, she said again. He didn't touch me. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned back to Caruso. Pull everything we have on the man with him. I want identification by morning. Caruso nodded and moved away. The other man followed. The alley emptied of everyone but the 2 of them. The quiet that was left was a different kind. He knows about the federal consultation, she said. He mentioned the plate run. He knows something pointed investigators at this block. Damiano didn't respond immediately. Is that... She stopped. Something in the way he didn't respond immediately had a texture she didn't like. Is that information that should surprise you? He looked at her, and she saw it. Not guilt. Damiano Viscari's face was not capable of guilt in any legible form, but something moved behind his eyes, a fractional recalibration of what he was about to say, an adjustment so small that 2 weeks ago she would not have been able to read it. She could read it now. She had spent enough mornings across a pastry counter from him to know the difference between what his face was doing and what it was choosing not to do. Damiano, she said, go inside. Tell me what you just didn't say. Noel, tell me. Her voice was very flat. The plate run. The federal consultants on this block. Did you do that before or after I gave you the notebook? The pause was less than a second, but it was there. Before, she said. Not a question anymore. He met her eyes. Yes. The cold settled into the alley with a different weight. She stood very still and listened to the sound of the city past the alley walls. A siren somewhere, distant, moving away. And she processed what she had just understood. Holden wasn't brought in because of the notebook, she said. No. He was already here. Yes. You were already running an operation against Gavin Mercer. She heard her voice coming from somewhere outside herself, very measured. Before you ever asked me about my collarbone. Before any of this. The operation against Mercer's financial network was separate from... Was I part of it? She looked at him. Was I a target of the investigation? Were you cultivating me because of what I might have seen on his laptop? The pause this time was longer. And that pause, that single pause, was the answer. Her chest went cold in a specific way that was not fear and was not rage, but was something that lived underneath both, the sensation of a floor you had been carefully standing on, revealing itself as false. How long? She said. I noticed the collarbone before I connected you to Mercer. That part was true. That's not what I asked. 6 weeks after you were hired, my financial analyst flagged a pattern in your bank transfers. The recurring outgoing payment, the account it was going to. He kept his voice level. It took another 2 months to connect that account to Mercer's network. By that point, I had been watching you work every morning for 8 weeks. Watching me, she said. Watching the kitchen. Don't. She took one step back. Don't do the semantics. You built a file on me. You came into my kitchen with a question about my collarbone because you needed access to what I knew, and using my injury was the fastest way through my defenses. I came in with that question because I had been watching a woman protect herself alone for 6 weeks, and it was... He stopped. What? She said. Say it. It was unbearable to watch. The honesty of it landed in a way she hadn't prepared for. She had braced for an argument, a justification, a version of the truth arranged to look better than it was. She had not braced for that. The flatness of it, the absence of performance. She looked at him. You used me, she said. Whatever else is also true. You used what I was carrying to get what you needed. He didn't deny it. Yes. And Petra, the coverage on her clinic today? Real. Not contingent on anything. How do I know that? You don't, he said. You decide whether to believe it. She stood in the cold of the alley with 22 months of careful architecture around her and felt it shift on its foundation. Not collapse, not yet, but shift, the way a structure shifts when the ground underneath changes and you have to determine quickly whether what you're standing in is still viable. She had handed him the notebook. She had given Holden 22 months of silence in 11 handwritten lines. She had done it because she had started incrementally and against every rational instinct she possessed to believe that the thing behind his eyes when he looked at her was something she could trust, and it was real. She still thought it was real. She had not lost the ability to read people well enough to manufacture that from nothing. But real was not the same as simple, and she was standing in an alley at midnight understanding that the man in front of her had entered her life through the back door of her worst experience and used it carefully, precisely, because he was the kind of man who found the most direct route to what he needed and did not let the cost of the route stop him. She was also standing in an alley at midnight because she had done the same thing. She had walked out here because she thought she could manage Gavin alone, and she had been wrong, and Damiano had materialized through the kitchen door and put himself between her and a man who had come here with another person, and God only knew what else, because she had made a unilateral decision without telling anyone, and it had been the same brand of miscalculation she was furious at him for. She breathed. He waited. He was very good at waiting. She had noticed this before and filed it. The operation, she said. Where does it stand now? Holden has the account numbers. The financial trail connects Mercer to the Carrera Syndicate at a level that supports federal indictment. The timeline is... Days, she said. You said days. Yes. Gavin knows something is moving. He came here tonight because he's cornered. She looked at the alley entrance where he had disappeared. Cornered men don't walk away and wait. No, Damiano said. They don't. What does he do next? He tries to eliminate the problem before the timeline closes. She looked at him. I'm the problem. You have been the problem since he saw you in this building. The siren she'd heard earlier was gone. The city was doing what it did at midnight. Not sleeping, not quite, but breathing differently. Slower. More honest. She looked at her hands, then back at him. What happens now, she said. You don't go home tonight. You stay here. I have a... Noel. His voice did not rise. It never rose. He walked out of this alley, and he is going to make a phone call inside the next 30 minutes, and whatever he says in that call will determine whether you are safe in your apartment. He held her gaze. Don't go home tonight. She wanted to argue. She had the argument assembled and ready, and it was good. It was about autonomy and trust, and the fact that she was not a piece to be moved. And she looked at his face in the low light of the alley, and the argument was correct in every way that mattered, and she was still not going to use it because the collarbone was reminding her, dully, through the leather and the thermal layer and the 22 months of careful management, what happened when she let the argument be more important than the reality. I want a room with a lock, she said. Yes. And I want to know exactly what Holden is doing. Every step, no more. She stopped. No more deciding what I need to know. He nodded once. She walked past him toward the kitchen door. At the threshold she stopped, hand on the frame, back to him. The thing you said, that it was unbearable to watch. She did not turn around. Was that true, or was that the most efficient thing you could have said? A pause. Both, he said. She went inside. Pepe. The room they gave her was on the building's second floor behind the administrative offices, a space that had been used for storage and then converted into something that functioned as a bedroom with the undecorated practicality of a place set up for necessity rather than comfort. A bed, a lock on the door, a window she could check herself. She checked the window first. Second floor, fire escape below, a sight line to the street that was clear in both directions. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her phone showed 2 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and a text from Petra that said, "Noel, are you okay? Someone came to my building tonight. I didn't let them in. Who was he?" Her whole body went rigid. She called Petra immediately. It rang 3 times. 3 times that lasted approximately 3 years each. And then, "Noel, are you inside your apartment right now? Doors locked?" "Yes, Yes. What is going on? This man knocked? He said he was from the billing office, but it was almost 11 at night, and I have a chain lock. I kept the chain." "Good. Keep it on." Noelle pressed her free hand flat against her knee. "Don't open it for anyone until I tell you to. Not anyone." "You're scaring me." "I know. I'm sorry." "Petra, listen to me. You're safe right now. You did the right thing. Just stay inside." A silence on the other end, and she could hear Petra's breathing, the particular cadence of it that she had memorized years before Petra's accident and could read like a language. Fear, but functional, shaken, but holding. "Noelle," Petra said. "What did you do?" She closed her eyes. "I stopped being afraid," she said. She hung up and went immediately to the door and knocked twice, and when it opened, one of the men she didn't know, not Caruso, she said, "Greenpoint, my sister's building, right now. She is alone and someone just knocked on her door tonight." The man looked at her for exactly 1 second, and then he was on his phone before the door fully closed. She went back to the bed, sat down, put her phone face up on her knee. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the city, Gavin Mercer was making the phone call Damiano had predicted. And whatever he was saying into it, whatever calculation he had run in the 30 minutes since the alley, was going to determine the shape of everything that came next. She had spent 22 months in a controlled retreat, giving ground slowly, deliberately, buying time, managing the variables she could reach. She had been patient in the way that people were patient when patience was the only weapon available. The notebook was in Holden's hands. Petra had kept the chain on. And she was sitting in a room above a restaurant that was also something else entirely, belonging to a man who had used her pain as a doorway, and had also, without being asked, put 2 men at a loading dock on a cold November morning because she existed in his orbit and he did not allow certain things inside what he considered his. She did not know what to do with any of that yet. She only knew that whatever Gavin Mercer said into his phone in the next 30 minutes was going to open a door that had no handle on the inside, and when it opened, she was going to have to be something she had not allowed herself to be for 2 years. Not managed, not contained, not the woman who pressed 2 fingers against a broken bone and moved on. She was going to have to be dangerous. She sat in the quiet room and breathed, and for the first time in 22 months, she did not press her fingers against her collarbone. She let it hurt. She did not sleep. She lay on the bed with her shoes on, and her eyes on the ceiling, and her phone on her chest, and she listened to the building settle and the street outside do what streets did between 2 and 4 in the morning, and she did not sleep because sleep required a level of surrender that was not available to her tonight. At 2:41, a text from an unknown number, different from the one Gavin had used, shorter prefix, Greenpoint secure. She's covered. She read it 3 times. Put the phone back on her chest. At 3:18, the building made a sound that was wrong, not loud. That was the thing. It was almost nothing, a compression of sound rather than sound itself, the way pressure changed in a room when a door that should be closed was opened somewhere below. She had grown up in apartments with thin walls, and she had spent 2 years sleeping with one ear on the world outside. and she had learned to read the vocabulary of buildings the way other people read text. The neutral sounds, the expected sounds, and the sounds that didn't belong. This didn't belong. She was off the bed before she had consciously decided to move. Shoes already on, phone in her pocket. She crossed to the window. Fire escape clear, street below empty, one car idling at the far corner that hadn't been there when she checked last. She crossed to the door, put her ear against it. Voices. Low. Not the building's voices. The voices of people trying not to make voices. She stepped back from the door, looked at the room, the window, the door, the bed that was bolted to the wall, and the dresser that wasn't. She put her back against the wall beside the door, and she picked up the phone and she texted Damiano the one word she had hoped she would not need to use, now. 3 seconds. Then the door came in. Not kicked, opened with a key, which was in some ways worse because it meant the person on the other side had the building's access, had gotten inside the building without the alarm, which meant something had failed in the chain of security between the alley and this room that she did not have time to analyze. 2 men. She had been right about the sound. They were moving carefully, flashlights rather than the overhead light, and they came through the door already scanning, which meant they were professionals or close enough to it. And the first one's light swept to the bed before it swept to the wall where she was standing. That was her 3-second window. She hit the first man's wrist with the heel of her right hand, hard, angled, the way you hit a joint when you wanted the hand to open. And the flashlight clattered. The second man was already moving, and she was already moving, and the room was very small, and the collision was more animal than tactical. Her shoulder catching his jaw, the wrong shoulder, the left one. And the pain that went through her was red and immediate, and she heard herself make a sound that was not quite a cry, but was close. She grabbed the door frame, used it to pull herself through before either of them could recover their orientation in the dark. The hallway. The stairwell door was to the left. She went right instead toward the office, because the stairwell was where they would expect, and she had learned 2 years ago that the only advantage a smaller person had against a larger threat was doing the thing they hadn't prepared for. She heard them behind her. Heavy on the stairs she hadn't taken. They'd split, one checking the stairwell, one coming down the hall. The office door was unlocked. She went inside, closed it, did not lock it, because a locked door in a searched building was an announcement. She moved to the far side of the desk and crouched, and she pressed her right hand against her left shoulder, and she breathed through her teeth, and she did a rapid and brutal assessment of how much use her left arm had at this exact moment. The answer was not enough. She heard footsteps in the hall. Stop outside the door. Move on. She waited. Her phone vibrated. Silent mode, but she felt it against her hip. She pulled it out. Damiano. Where? She typed, admin office. 2 of them, maybe more. They have key access. A pause that lasted long enough for her to count her own heartbeats. 8. Then, don't move. 2 minutes. She looked at the door. The footsteps had moved past and then doubled back, and she could hear them. Closer now. The methodical search pattern of men with a brief and a layout. And she had the office, and she had approximately 90 seconds, and she had one functional arm and a desk between her and the door. She picked up the desk chair. Right arm, balanced against her right hip. She positioned herself beside the door rather than behind the desk, because behind the desk was where the person in the office was supposed to be. And she had already established tonight that she was done doing what was expected of her. The door opened. She swung the chair into the man coming through it with everything her right arm and her right shoulder and the pivot of her hips could generate, and the impact was loud and ugly, and he went sideways into the door frame with a sound like air leaving a body all at once. She was already through the door before he hit the floor, stepping over him, back into the hallway. The second man was at the stairwell entrance 10 feet away. He had a gun. She stopped. The hallway was very quiet. He was big. Bigger than she'd registered in the dark of the room, with the kind of build that made him take up the width of a narrow hallway in a way that blocked both the stairwell and the light switch on the wall beside it. He had the gun at his side, not raised, which meant he was not here to shoot her in a hallway. He was here to move her somewhere. That distinction mattered. She filed it. Where? She said. He looked at her. Where are you taking me? She said. He gestured with the gun toward the stairwell. Down. She went. They came out through the loading dock. The same loading dock she arrived at every morning before sunrise, the same concrete steps, the same smell of wet pavement and industrial bins. But the dock was different tonight, empty of the men who should have been there, the Caruso-adjacent presences that had been her reluctant comfort for the past week, and in their place, idling with its lights off at the bottom of the service ramp, a black SUV with its rear door already open. She stopped at the top of the steps. The man behind her put one hand on her right shoulder, and she moved with the pressure rather than against it, a calculation, not a surrender. And she came down the steps and she looked into the open door of the SUV, and she saw Gavin Mercer sitting in the far seat with his jacket off and his tie loose, and the expression of a man who had been waiting and was very tired of waiting. She got in. The door closed. Checked. The SUV moved. She didn't look at the windows to try to track the route. She looked at Gavin, because Gavin was the variable that mattered. He looked at her left arm, where she was holding it against her body with her right hand. "Did they hurt you?" he said. "You sent them." "I told them not to hurt you." "Then we have different definitions." He looked at her arm for another moment. Then he looked at her face with an expression she had never quite seen from him before. Not the pleasant surface, not the cold precision, but something underneath both that was raw in an unflattering way. Exhausted, almost frightened. The face of a man who had run out of the controlled options and was now running on the uncontrolled ones, which was, she knew, the most dangerous version of Gavin Mercer there was. "Holden is DOJ, he said. "I confirmed it an hour ago." She said nothing. "Whatever you gave him, so the account numbers, the transfers, everything, it went directly into a federal investigation that has been running for 18 months. He put his elbows on his knees and rubbed both hands over his face in a gesture so unguarded it was almost strange to watch. "Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand what you did," she said, 2 years ago against a doorframe." He dropped his hands, looked at her. "You are going to tell me," he said, "that you didn't know what you were handing over, that you thought it was just account numbers, that you had no idea Vescari was running a parallel operation and you were the bridge he used to link his intelligence to federal channels." He paused. "Are you going to tell me that?" She kept her face still. "Because if that's true," he said, "then you have been used, Noelle, the same way you always accused me of using you. And the people who used you have what they need, and you have what? A broken shoulder and a storage room, and a man who will move on to the next useful person when this is done." The SUV turned. She felt the inertia of it in her left shoulder and held still. "Or," Gavin said, "you knew exactly what you were doing. You made a choice. You picked a side." He looked at her with something that might have been, under very different circumstances, a version of respect. "Which is it?" She looked out the window for the first time. The waterfront. She could see the river, the lights on the far bank. They were moving south along the water, away from the financial district, and the geography assembled itself in her mind with the flat clarity of a problem being mapped. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere we can finish this conversation without interruption. Damiano knows I'm gone." "Damiano," Gavin said, "is currently dealing with a situation in his building that will occupy him for at least the next 40 minutes. Her stomach tightened. "What situation?" "The situation I created while his men were coming for you." He straightened up. Back to the pleasant surface. She could see him reassembling it piece by piece, the suit jacket off, but everything else being pulled back into order. "He is a formidable person. I want to be honest with you about that. I underestimated his reach and his interest in your specific situation, and that was an error I have now corrected." He fixed his cuff. "But he cannot be in 2 places at once. And right now you are in this car, with me, and we are going to come to an arrangement that keeps both of us alive." Diptotan. She looked at him. "The Carrera people," he said. "They know about the DOJ investigation. They know it's been fed from inside the city. They are not going to wait for an indictment to decide how to manage their exposure." He paused precisely. "I am their exposure. And so are you, now that you've given Holden those accounts. We are in the same position, Noelle. We are both loose ends. We are not in the same position, structurally. Don't." She turned on him in the confined back seat of the moving SUV with her left arm against her body and her right hand free, and 22 months of everything she had been holding finally off its leash. Don't sit in a car you put me in against my will and tell me we're in the same position. You broke my collarbone. You extorted 2 years of my income. You sent someone to knock on my sister's door at 11 o'clock at night. We are not in the same position. He let her finish. He had always been good at letting her finish. She had once interpreted this as patience. She understood now it was tactical. You're right, he said. I have done all of those things. And I am sitting here telling you that the people I work for are going to do something worse to both of us if we don't reach an agreement in the next... He checked his watch. 40 minutes. What kind of agreement? The kind where you tell Holden you made a mistake, that the numbers were wrong, that your memory is imperfect, and you can't stand behind the testimony. He looked at her. And in exchange, the monthly transfers stop. The debt is zeroed. Your sister is untouched. She looked at him. And what do you tell the Carrera people? She said. That the liability is contained. And then I disappear, he said. Out of your life, out of this city. I've been planning a transition for some time. This accelerates it. She was quiet for a moment. The SUV slowed. Traffic, or a turn, she couldn't tell which. The waterfront lights moved across the window. You actually believe, she said, that I would do that. I believe you want your sister safe. I believe you have said that so many times that it has stopped meaning what you think it means. She looked at him with the flat steadiness she had been cultivating in the kitchen every morning for 14 months. You told me Petra was leveraged the first time and the second time and the 15th time, and every time I paid. And I paid because I was afraid and I had no other option. But I gave those account numbers to Holden because I finally had one. And you taking me out of that building in an SUV is not removing my option. It's confirming that you have nothing left but this. His jaw tightened. You're betting, he said, that Viscari is coming for you. I'm not betting on anyone, she said. I'm telling you that I am done. The SUV stopped. She looked out the window. They were at the waterfront. A commercial pier, the kind used for freight. The kind that was empty at 4 in the morning with the specific dead quality of industrial spaces that didn't exist for anyone's comfort or convenience. Ahead, past the chain-link gate that was standing open, the dark shapes of cargo containers stacked 3 high, and between them the black geometry of the pier itself extending over black water. The man in the front passenger seat got out. The driver stayed. Gavin looked at her. We're going to continue this inside, he said. I'm not going in there. Noelle. I am not going in there. He opened his door, came around to hers, opened it. She looked at him standing in the cold waterfront air with his jacket still inside the car and his tie loosened and the look of a man who had nothing left but forward momentum, and she made the calculation she had been making since the room, how much time, what he needed, what would make him wait rather than push, and she got out. The pier smelled like salt and rust and diesel. The cargo containers formed corridors between them, the metal groaning in the wind off the water, and the sound it made was low and structural, like the building equivalent of an animal that was very large and very cold. They walked 30 feet into the container corridor before she stopped. Here, she said. Further. Here. She turned to face him. You wanted a conversation? Have it. He looked past her toward the deeper dark between containers, calculating something. She could see it, the brief internal arithmetic of a man deciding whether the geometry was right. Then the gunshot. It came from the far end of the corridor, not close, but not far. A single shot that hit the container wall 8 feet above them and left a sound that rang in the metal around them like a bell. She dropped, right hand to the ground, left arm screaming, her whole body behind a corrugated steel wall before the echo finished. Gavin was against the opposite container. His gun was in his hand now. He'd had it on him the whole time. Of course he had. She looked at him. That wasn't yours, she said. His face confirmed it. The corridor went quiet. Then from the far end, a voice she didn't know, accented, unhurried. Mercer, step out. Gavin's face in the half-light of the pier was the most honest she had ever seen it, stripped of the surface, just the raw material of a man who had overplayed his hand and was now standing inside the consequence of it. Carrera, he said, low, to her, not to the voice. They followed you, she said. They followed the car. He looked at the gun in his hand, then at her. They're not here for me. Not primarily. She understood. She had understood from the moment she'd heard the accented voice, the careful, unhurried quality of it, the way it had said his name rather than hers. They were here to close the liability, both of them. She pressed her back against the container wall and breathed and felt her left shoulder with a kind of clinical remove, functional, barely, painful beyond her current ability to quantify. And she looked at the 30 feet of corridor between her position and the open pier, and she looked at Gavin. And she heard footsteps beginning to move at the far end. She had no weapon. She had one functional arm. She was inside a cargo pier in the dark with a man who had put her here, and men who had come to finish what that man had started. And somewhere 40 minutes away was a building where Damiano Vescari was dealing with a situation that Gavin had created specifically to prevent what was now the only thing that could change the geometry of this pier before it closed around both of them. She pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course. She looked at it. 0 bars. The dead zone of a freight pier at 4 in the morning. Concrete and metal and water. And nothing. Is there another way out? She said. Gavin looked at her. Of this corridor, she said. Is there another exit? He looked past her, toward the end they'd come from, and something moved in his face. The involuntary look of a man reviewing a layout he had been inside before. Left, he said. Between the last container and the railing, there's a gap. How big? Enough. Enough for what? He looked at her. His face was doing something she had never seen it do. Something small and structural, like a wall developing a crack from the inside. Enough to run, Maud, he said. The footsteps were getting closer. She could see the light now. Tactical flashlights, 2 of them, sweeping the corridor in the systematic pattern of people who knew what they were doing and had done it before. Gavin raised his gun. She grabbed his wrist with her right hand. He stared at her. That makes noise, she said. They'll close the other end. I'm not... He stopped, looked at her hand on his wrist, then at her face, with an expression that had no history she could reference, nothing she could compare it to, because she had never seen Gavin Mercer frightened without the pleasant surface layered over it. I'm not letting them take me. I know, so move. She released his wrist. Left, now. He moved. She followed. The gap between the last container and the pier railing was exactly as wide as enough, which was not a generous measurement. She turned sideways, right side forward, and pulled herself through with her right hand on the container edge and her left arm held tight against her body. And she came out onto the open pier with the wind off the water hitting her full in the face and the black river 30 feet below, and behind her the sound of tactical flashlights sweeping the corridor they had just exited. Gavin was already at the pier edge looking at the water. She came up beside him, looked at the water, looked at the pier, looked at the access road 200 feet to the left, past an open section of railing, if the railing was open at all, if the geometry worked, if... Headlights. At the pier entrance. Coming fast. Multiple vehicles. The specific urgency of vehicles that were not asking permission. And she had time to think too late and then time to think or not, because the headlights were not stopping at the gate. They were through the gate. They were on the pier road. And the first one was a black SUV that she recognized. Not Gavin's. The second one was the same. The third. They came in hard and fast and stopped in a formation that cut off the pier road with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before in a different context. And the doors opened, and the men who came out of them moved in a way that the Carrera men in the container corridor did not move. Controlled, precise, coordinated. And then the last door of the first SUV opened. Damiano Vescari walked out onto the waterfront pier in his shirt sleeves in the 4 in the morning cold, with the same quality of stillness he had in his kitchen and his office and his alley, the quality of a man who occupied every space he entered with the certainty of someone who had decided long ago that the world would arrange itself around him rather than the other way around. And he walked toward the container corridor entrance without running because he never ran, and he stopped when he saw her, 40 feet between them. She stood at the pier edge with Gavin Mercer beside her and her left arm held against her chest and the wind off the water making her eyes stream, and she looked at Damiano across 40 feet of concrete and cold air. He looked at her left arm. She saw it. The thing that crossed his face when he looked at her arm, the thing that wasn't in his taxonomy, the thing that existed outside the controlled surface he maintained in every room he had ever been in. Then it was gone. The surface came back. His eyes moved to Gavin. From inside the container corridor, shouts, a scuffle, the metallic crash of a body against corrugated steel. His men were inside. Gavin raised his gun. Not at the men coming out of the container corridor. Not at Damiano. At her. The gun was at her temple before she registered the movement, his left hand on her right shoulder, pulling her back against him, the barrel cold against the side of her head. And she went still with the particular stillness of someone who had done the threat assessment in under a second and reached the conclusion that stillness was the correct response. Damiano stopped. His men stopped. Everything on the pier stopped. Gavin's breathing was loud beside her ear, fast, shallow, the breathing of a man who had just made the last available move in a game he was losing and knew it, and was making it anyway because there was nothing left. "You rule a criminal empire," Gavin said. His voice had lost the pleasant surface entirely. What was underneath was older and less managed, something that had been there the whole time under all the good suits and the calibrated handshakes. "But one broken woman became your weakness." Damiano looked at him. Then he looked at her, and she looked back at him. At this man who had entered her kitchen with a question and taken her life apart and put himself between her and the worst of what came out, and who had used her and protected her in the same breath, and who was standing 40 feet away on a pier at 4 a.m. in his shirt sleeves looking at her like she was the only fixed point in his. Damiano lowered his weapon. Not slowly, cleanly, in one deliberate motion, the gun coming down to his side with the finality of a decision already made. His men held. The pier held. The wind off the water was the only thing that kept moving, cutting across the open concrete with the indifference of weather toward the specific catastrophes of human beings. Gavin's breathing was loud against her ear. She could feel his chest moving against her back. Too fast. Too shallow. The rhythm of a man whose nervous system had taken over from his judgment. The gun barrel was cold against her temple. Cold in the specific way of metal that had been outside in November at 4 a.m, not the transferred warmth of a weapon recently handled with intent. He hadn't decided yet. That was what she read in the breathing and the cold metal and the way his left hand gripped her right shoulder. Too hard. The grip of someone holding on rather than controlling. He had raised the gun because it was the last move available, not because he had mapped out what came after it. She had approximately 30 seconds before that changed. She looked at Damiano. He was looking at her. Not at Gavin. Not at the gun. At her face. And she understood that he was waiting. Not passively. The way a coiled thing waited. Contained, precise, reading something. She had seen him read a room in 2 seconds. He was reading her now. She moved her eyes left. Just her eyes. 1 degree. Gavin's weight was on his right leg. She knew this because she could feel the slight pull of his grip compensating. The left side of his body was the anchor, the right side was where the balance lived. She had spent 2 years cataloging how Gavin Mercer used his body to manage other people, and she had filed all of it in the part of her mind that kept things she never wanted to need. She needed it now. She dropped. Not sideways, not backward, straight down, knees folding, dead weight, the way a person dropped when they stopped holding themselves up. And Gavin's grip on her shoulder had nowhere to go, and his balance was already on the wrong leg, and the gun came off her temple by 6 inches as his body tried to compensate for the sudden absence of the thing he'd been bracing against. 6 inches. The shot from Damiano's gun was a single clean sound over the water. The gun flew from Gavin's hand. Not the hand? The gun. She registered this in the half-second before she hit the concrete on her right side. Her left arm tucked, the impact jarring but controlled, and she looked up from the pier surface to see Gavin Mercer standing with his right hand cradled against his chest, fingers intact, the gun 6 feet away on the concrete, and an expression on his face that had never been there before in any of the years she had known him. Genuine shock. He looked at his hand, then at the gun on the pier, then at Damiano, who had already lowered his weapon again and was crossing the 40 feet between them at the same unhurried pace he brought to every room he entered. Gavin ran, not toward his men, not toward the container corridor, toward the railing at the pier edge, the specific, irrational direction of a man whose thinking had collapsed into pure animal momentum. He got 4 steps before Caruso came out of nowhere on the left, and took him down in a tackle that was efficient and completely without drama, and the sound of Gavin hitting the pier concrete was loud and final and carried out over the black water. It was over in 11 seconds from the moment she dropped. Damiano crouched beside her on the pier. Not dramatic, not running. He simply arrived at the place where she was and went to one knee on the concrete and looked at her with the expression she had seen cross his face when he'd registered her left arm, the thing that existed outside his controlled vocabulary. "Can you move your shoulder?" he said. She almost laughed. She did not laugh because the pain was too current and the pier was too cold, and she was lying on her right side on a freight dock at 4 in the morning, and the situation did not call for it. But something moved in her chest that was adjacent to it, a pressure, a release, something that had been held for a very long time. "I moved it," she said. "That's how I got down." "I know." He put one hand on the concrete beside her, not touching, the same way he'd placed his hand on the pastry counter. "I saw." She pushed herself upright with her right arm. He did not help her, and she did not want him to. And he understood this without it being said, which was, she noticed it even here, even now. One of the things that was true about him in the way that mattered. She got herself sitting, then standing. Her left arm was not good. The shoulder had taken the drop, and the cold, and the accumulated damage of a night that had started badly and progressed in the way of nights that started badly, and it was telling her about all of it in a language that was vivid and specific and left no room for ambiguity. She looked at Caruso, who had Gavin on his feet with his arms behind him, Gavin's face doing the work of a man processing the total collapse of every structure he had relied on. She looked at the container corridor where 3 men were being walked out with their hands visible by Damiano's people. She looked at the pier entrance, where the SUVs were positioned with their lights cutting the dark. She looked at Damiano. "The Carrera men in the corridor," she said. "Handled." Handled how? Contained and coordinated with Holden's people. They'll be in federal custody by morning. He held her gaze. Clean, legal, the way it was always going to end. And Gavin? Same. She looked at Gavin. He was standing with Caruso's hand on his shoulder and his right hand still cradled against his chest. She could see now, in the pier lights, that 2 fingers were bent in a way they shouldn't be. The recoil from losing a gun to a precise shot at that distance leaving its own kind of signature. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the water, or through it, with the vacant quality of someone whose interior monologue had run out of content. She walked over to him. Caruso looked at Damiano. Damiano gave a small nod. Caruso stepped back 2 feet, which was not much but was the distance that made the next 30 seconds her own. Gavin looked at her when she stopped in front of him. Up close, in the light, he looked older than she had ever seen him. Not in years, but in the way some nights extracted a specific tax from a face, leaving behind something that the morning couldn't fully reimburse. The pleasant surface was entirely gone. What was underneath was a man who was 50% calculation and 50% the specific kind of fear that came from running out of calculations. She had spent 2 years being afraid of this man. She stood in front of him now and took inventory of what she felt and found that the word for it was not the word she had expected. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more complicated than either. The particular exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down, and discovering that the absence of the weight felt strange rather than light. "The debt," she said. "What you told me Petra owed. What you took from me every month." He said nothing. "I need to hear you say it," she said. "I need to hear you say it was false." "It was false," he said, flatly. The last reserve of his precision deployed in a context he had not anticipated. She looked at him for another moment. "I'm going to testify," she said. "Everything I saw on your laptop, every transfer I made to your account, every phone call where you used Petra's name to make sure I stayed quiet, all of it." She kept her voice even. "And I need you to understand that I'm not doing it because Vescari asked me to, or Holden needs the testimony, or because I want something from the process. I'm doing it because I spent 2 years letting you tell me that staying silent was the only way to protect the people I loved. And I need to know, in my own life, in my own record, that when I finally stopped being silent, I went all the way." Gavin looked at her. His face was doing something she could not fully classify and did not spend time trying to. "You're going to be fine," he said. not sarcastically. She read it, and it wasn't sarcasm. It was something that had the texture of a genuine assessment, the last honest thing maybe from a man who had built his entire existence on dishonesty, offered in a context where there was nothing left to gain from it. She turned and walked back toward the SUVs. The hospital was not a conversation she wanted to have, and had at 5:47 in the morning under fluorescent lights that were the same color as the lights in the vitro kitchen, which she noted with the detached observation of someone whose mind was still cataloging things that didn't require cataloging. The ER physician was a small woman with dark circles and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the economy of movement of someone 12 hours into a shift that had held nothing back. She looked at the X-ray with a neutrality that Noelle appreciated. The original fracture healed badly, the physician said. You have two options: conservative management with physiotherapy, extended timeline, incomplete function recovery likely, or reconstructive surgery, longer up front, significantly better long-term outcome. How long for recovery after surgery? Full function, 6 months minimum. Realistic return to professional kitchen work, 8-9 months, depending. Noelle looked at the X-ray. The white line of the clavicle, the visible irregularity of the old break, the history of it rendered in bone. Surgery, she said. The physician wrote something down. Do you want to call someone? Family? Not yet. She looked at the ceiling. Let her sleep. Damiano was in the waiting room when she came out, not pacing, sitting in one of the plastic chairs with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and his jacket still in the SUV where he'd left it at the pier, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow in the harsh hospital light. He looked up when she came through the door. She crossed the waiting room and sat down in the chair beside him. They sat in silence for a moment. Surgery, she said. When? They can do it next week if I'm cleared. The pre-op work starts tomorrow. She looked at her hands in her lap. 8-9 months before I'm back in a kitchen. He said nothing. She felt him not saying it, the weight of what he could have said and was choosing not to. I want to talk about what you told me in the alley, she said. What you admitted. All right. I'm not going to tell you it was acceptable, she said, using my injury as access, building a file on me without my knowledge, pulling me into an operation I hadn't agreed to. I know. It wasn't. It was a specific kind of violation, even though the intent behind it was different from Gavin's intent. Intent doesn't change what it was. No, he said. It doesn't. She turned her head to look at him. He was already looking at her with the same quality of attention he had brought to every conversation they'd had. The attention that didn't flinch and didn't perform. I also know, she said, that you came to appear at 4 a.m. in your shirt sleeves, and that you lowered your weapon because I needed you to, and that the shot you took, she stopped. You didn't have to take that shot yourself. You had people. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculated pause. The real kind. The kind that meant something was being found rather than arranged. Because it was mine to take, he said. She looked at him. That's not an explanation. It's the only one I have. She turned back to her hands. The waiting room was beginning to populate with the early morning arrivals. A man with a child asleep on his shoulder. A woman in scrubs who had come off shift and was crying very quietly into her phone. A teenager with a wrapped wrist sitting very still. I'm going to need 8 months, she said, before I come back to the kitchen. I know. I'll be paid through the recovery, full salary. That's not negotiable. It wasn't going to be. And when I come back, the credit for the cannoli goes on the menu under my name. A pause. And then, from beside her, something she had not heard from him before and could not have predicted, a sound that was very quiet and very brief and was, unmistakably, a laugh. Not performed, not social. The sound of something genuinely catching a person off guard. She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had no previous record of on his face. Something open in it, something that had been there underneath everything else for a long time and was now in a hospital waiting room at 6 a.m, with the pier cold still in his shirt and the night's full weight on both of them, simply present. Yes, he said. Your name. Petra cried for 11 minutes when Noelle called at 7:30. Not the quiet, careful crying she did when she was trying to protect Noelle from the extent of her feelings. The real kind, the ugly kind, the kind that came out of 2 years of sensing that something was wrong with her sister and not being given the language for it. Noelle sat in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and listened to her sister cry and said very little because there was nothing to say that was more honest than the sound of it. When it was done, Petra said, "The collarbone. How long have you been hiding it?" 22 months. A silence. Noelle. I know. Why didn't you? I know you would have. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. That's why. Another silence, longer. Is it over? Petra asked. Yes. All of it. All of it. She heard Petra breathe, in and out, slowly. When are you coming home? Not for a few days. There are things I need to do here first. She paused. And then I have to schedule a surgery. I'm coming. You have PT. Noelle. I'm coming. She did not argue. Holden came to the hospital at 9 with 2 other people she didn't recognize and a document she had been expecting. She read it carefully. All of it, every clause, before she signed, because she had learned the specific cost of not reading what she was agreeing to. Holden watched her read without impatience, which she respected. When she finished, she signed. The federal timeline, she said. Mercer's cooperation is being assessed. Given the evidence from the accounts and your testimony, the Carrera connection is the primary target. Mercer is leverage rather than centerpiece. He folded the document. There will be a period of visibility. Your name will be part of the record. I know. Some people find that difficult. I spent 2 years being invisible, she said. I'll manage. He looked at her for a moment with the dry, economical gaze she had come to associate with people who had spent a long time watching other people make decisions and had learned not to project onto those decisions. You should know, he said, that what you did, providing that testimony, the account numbers, without that specific connection, the Carrera financial infrastructure stays intact. We had pieces. You gave us the architecture. She thought about that, about the laptop screen in Gavin's apartment, about the account numbers she had memorized without intending to and carried for 22 months, like something contaminated that she couldn't set down safely. About the notebook on page 12. I didn't do it for the investigation, she said. I know, Holden said. That's what made it useful. She was discharged with a temporary brace, a prescription, and an appointment card for the surgical consult. She stood outside the hospital entrance in the November morning with the city doing what it did, moving, indifferent, continuous, and she breathed in the cold air and let her eyes close for a moment. The SUV was at the curb. She opened her eyes. Caruso was behind the wheel, and Damiano was standing beside the rear door, and the morning light was doing something unflattering and honest to his face that she thought probably did the same to hers. I can take a cab, she said. I know. She looked at him. Noelle. He said it the same way he had said it every time. Flat, certain, like placing something solid on a surface. But there was something different in the layer underneath it now, something that had been deposited there by a night that had cost both of them in ways they hadn't finished counting. Let me take you home. She looked at the car, then at him. She got in. The months that followed were not graceful. The surgery was 4 hours and the recovery was brutal, in the specific way of recoveries that involved relearning something the body had compensated around for so long that the correct mechanics felt foreign. The physiotherapist was a no-nonsense woman named Delgado, who did not believe in being gentle when being gentle produced slower results, and Noelle respected this philosophically and found it excruciating in practice. Petra came and stayed for 3 weeks, and then went back to Brooklyn and called every other day. The calls were different from the calls they'd had before, less carefully managed, both of them, less curated. Petra talked about her own recovery with more honesty than she had since the accident. Noelle talked about the collarbone and the kitchen, and Gavin, and some of the nights in between with more honesty than she had ever extended to anyone. It was uncomfortable. It was also the realest thing she did in those months, and she knew it. Gavin Mercer entered a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors in January. The details came to her through Holden in the dry, factual language of legal process, and she read each update with the detachment she had cultivated in the kitchen, noting the information, filing it, moving on. The Carrera Syndicate's financial network was substantially dismantled by spring. There were names in the reporting she recognized and names she didn't. She did not follow the coverage closely because the coverage was not the thing. The thing had happened on a pier in November and in a pastry kitchen for 14 months before that, and the legal record was just the document that described what was already finished. Damiano visited, not every day, not on any schedule she could map. He appeared the way he appeared in his kitchen, unexpectedly, with coffee, with a quality of stillness that did not demand anything from the space it occupied. He sat in the chair beside the window in her apartment, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not. And she learned over those months that his silences had the same vocabulary as his words, varied, intentional, readable, once you had spent enough time with the language. She did not make it easy for him. She did not think she was supposed to. There were conversations that were difficult, about the file he had built, about the months of observation before the first question, about the way he had used what she was carrying as the opening he needed. She did not let those conversations stay diplomatic. He did not ask them to. He sat in the chair by the window and answered what she asked and did not ask for absolution that she wasn't prepared to give. And the not asking was, she understood slowly, its own form of respect. In March, she went to his office and placed a document on his desk. He looked at it. "The Academy," she said. He looked up. "The building next to Vetro has been empty for 8 months, she said. "I've been looking at the permits. The zoning allows for commercial culinary training." She sat down across from him. A culinary academy. Employment training and professional certification for domestic abuse survivors. Legal support on-site, in partnership with 2 organizations I've already contacted. She folded her hands on her knees. "I will run the pastry program. I have 3 other chefs who have agreed to participate if the structure is sound. The financial model is in the document." Sham Ban Titin. He looked at the document, then at her. "You built this," he said, "while you were in recovery." "I had time." He was quiet for a moment. "The building," he said. "I need it donated, not leased. The operating model can't carry rent." "All right." She looked at him. "That's it? All right?" "I've been waiting," he said, "to see what you would do with 8 months." She looked at him for a long time across the desk. The morning light came through the window behind him and did the honest thing again. Showed her a man who was what he was without adjustment, complicated in the way of people who had made choices that couldn't be cleanly categorized, and carried those choices without performing remorse or justification, and who had sat in a chair by her window through a winter and answered her difficult questions, and come to appear at 4 in the morning in his shirt sleeves. "I'm still angry about some of it," she said. "I know. That's probably not going to fully resolve." "I know that too." She picked up the document, stood, looked at him once more across the desk. "The cannoli are going back on the menu when I return," she said. "And the menu is going to list a new item, a pastry I've been developing in my kitchen for the past 3 months. It'll need your approval since it's your restaurant." "What is it?" "Come to the Academy opening," she said. "I'll have samples." She left. The opening was in September on a Thursday, in a building that smelled of fresh plaster and new kitchen equipment, and the particular clean possibility of a space that had not yet accumulated its history. She wore her chef's whites. No apron. She had not worn the leather apron since November, had not needed what it was built to provide. The shoulder moved with a stiffness that Delgado promised would continue to diminish, and that Noel had stopped measuring against what it used to be and started measuring against what it was becoming. 31 women came to the opening. Some were in programs already. Some had come because someone handed them a flyer on a street corner or slid it under a door or passed it across a counter in the specific quiet way that information moved between people who understood why some things needed to move carefully. She spoke briefly. Not long, not with the language of triumph, because triumph was for people who had come out the other side of something without cost, and everyone in the room had paid, and the cost deserved to be acknowledged rather than papered over with the vocabulary of victory. She said, "This kitchen belongs to you." She said, "Everything you learn here is yours to keep." She said, "The point is not that you survived, the point is what you build after." Then she opened the kitchen. The old leather apron was in a glass display case on the wall by the entrance. She had hung it herself that morning on a simple hook inside the case. No placard, no description. It was just there, heavy, worn at the edges, shaped by the 2 years she had spent inside it. And the people who understood what it meant would understand, and the people who didn't were not who it was for. Damiano was there. He stood near the back of the room during the brief speech, and he did not make himself known, and he did not require acknowledgement, which was, she had learned, one of the things that was consistently true about him in the way that mattered. He occupied space without demanding that the space notice him. She crossed the room to him when the kitchen had opened and the noise of 31 people beginning to inhabit a new place had filled the air with the specific warmth of activity that was its own kind of answer to everything that had come before. She handed him a small plate. He looked at it. A single piece of something, laminated pastry, the layers visible at the cut edge, a filling that was dark and aromatic. "What is it?" he said. "Black sesame and dark chocolate," she said, "with a burnt caramel layer. I've been working on the lamination for 3 months. The technique is mine." He picked it up, ate it with the same attention he had given the cannoli on a morning that now felt like it belonged to a different version of both of them. He chewed, set the remainder down. "It's better than the cannoli," he said. "I know." He looked at her. She looked back at him, at this man, this specific and irreducibly complicated man, and she felt standing in a room full of the sound of people beginning something, the particular quiet of a thing that had been long and hard and costly, arriving at a place that was not the end of anything, but was, undeniably, somewhere different from where it had started. She did not feel like a woman who had been saved. She felt like a woman who had done an enormous amount of difficult work, some of it alone and some of it in complicated partnership with a person she had not chosen and could not entirely trust and could not entirely dismiss, and had come out the other side of it standing in a kitchen she had built, in a body that was still healing, in a life that was unmistakably her own. Damiano reached over and took her left hand, carefully. The way you took something that had been through a great deal, not with the presumption of ownership, but with the attentiveness of someone who understood that certain things required handling with precision. She let him. Outside the academy's front window, the city moved the way it always moved, continuous, indifferent, producing its endless quantity of ordinary human noise. The November light was the same light it had been a year ago, the same angle, the same temperature, the color of something honest. She stood in her kitchen, in her academy, with his hand around hers, and she did not say anything, and neither did he. The leather apron hung in its case by the door. The shoulder would continue to heal. The account on the 1st of the month was closed, and somewhere in the specific geography of what she was becoming, not yet arrived, still moving, always moving, she recognized, without ceremony, that the question he had asked her over a tray of cannoli on a dark morning 14 months ago had never really been about a collarbone. It had been about whether she would let someone close enough to see the damage. She had. It had cost her something she was still calculating, and she was still here. That was, she thought, in the noise and the light and the hand around hers, enough.